recently we've been talking a lot about shelter. We're going to talk a lot about shelter in this conversation. But you'll see that there are other line items of things that we need to work on as a community to put a serious dent in it, and a lot of them are housing related. So let's talk briefly about things that are coming up a lot, that are going to be coming up in our panel today, which is that the city is going to be losing 614 shelter beds by the end of the year, and is trying to come up with solutions for that. Meanwhile, Mayor Todd Gloria wants to open up a shelter campus with up to 1,000 beds at Kettner and Vine in Middletown, and that could cost about $30 million annually to operate, and more when it comes to various building upgrades and lease payments. The negotiations with the owner of that warehouse continue. Also, the council voted in June to redirect millions of dollars that would have been directed to affordable housing projects to support homeless shelters. And homelessness-related enforcement and camping bans, as I'm sure many of the folks in this room know, have been very hot topics recently in the city and the county. So this is what's really been dominating our conversations about homelessness in recent history. Meanwhile, as that's happening, homeless San Diegans who access shelter are spending more time there waiting for housing. And about 18% of people that do exit actually get permanent housing. The homeless population is also increasingly vulnerable. We're seeing more seniors, more people with serious behavioral health challenges, more disabilities. And many people who try to get shelter right now in the city of San Diego can't get it. Also, the city's housing agency has not pulled from its Section 8 voucher waiting list for 2 years, and it's less equipped to direct vouchers to homeless-serving housing projects. And absent projects that are backed by the state's Home Key program, there really aren't that many new supportive housing projects designed to serve the most vulnerable. And you might hear this phrase come up. Often people will use the term permanent supportive housing. That's basically just a housing unit that comes with some extra services to help somebody remain housed. Okay, without further ado, after that briefing, we'll get into our discussion. So I want to have all of you on the panel here just reflect on the moment that we're in. You know, I was thinking as I was preparing for the panel about the fact that, you know, the city had been in the midst of this budget discussion and, you know, facing a possibility of big cuts to shelter a few months ago. And, you know, the mayor's been talking about a large shelter. And in the end, the council ended up punting on that shelter that could have cost $30 million in annual operations, and then voted also to pull millions that could have funded affordable housing projects, at least for now. And then we learned that hundreds of shelter beds are closing down, leading to this mad rush for new options. So it's quite a moment in homelessness in San Diego right now. What do you all make of these recent events and where we're at? Who wants to take that one? Levi?
A mindset first. So. Oh, let's get this guy going. Here, do you know?
Test. Okay. Yeah, so we have a very, very serious problem in San Diego when it comes to housing. As you can see, there's not enough housing. It is causing people to pour out onto the streets. So ultimately, like, what we need to be doing is building more housing. While, you know, obviously we do need more shelter accommodations for something that's going to cost that amount of money and not even, you know, be implementable for the next couple of years. That $30 million, I think, is much better spent on housing that is affordable for the San Diegans who are living in and running this city. So,
Ryan?
Thank you, Levi, for giving the rest of us a moment to wrap our head around that sweeping question. There was a city council hearing earlier this week that looked at short-term options for many of the issues that you mentioned, the loss of shelter beds that are looming. And one of the things that I found encouraging about that was even though it's a short-term emergency planning process, it seems to have gotten back to the core of the community action plan that was adopted originally in 2019. And the core of that plan was to focus on best practices, to listen to the perspectives of people with lived experience, like Levi, to incorporate the recommendations of frontline service workers and to pursue a broad range of options. And that seems to be a goal that has been elusive since 2019. But under the pressure of the looming loss in beds, the options that were laid out for the city included on the high end a net increase of 74 beds within the next 4 months if all options are pursued. And that's within the existing budget constraints. And I think what that shows is what is possible when we focus on pursuing realistic solutions along the pathways that we know work, and that it actually is an achievable goal. The enemy in the process, I think, is nihilism of assuming that homelessness cannot be solved. And I think that is the challenge, and the civic leaders that adopt that perspective that it's an unsolvable problem, I think, are taking the coward's way out of the solution.
And some,
Yeah, and to add to that, something for us to also consider is that we do have some successes that are happening, right? We are getting people into housing. The regional task force releases data each month that shows, on average, we get about 1,000 people into housing, but we do need to keep people housed. So at the same time, we're seeing more people becoming homeless. So we're not able to keep up with the inflow versus the outflow numbers. So we really need to invest in prevention, keeping people housed. We're also seeing seniors becoming homeless at a faster rate, people pricing out of their units. So we need to consider shallow subsidy for affordability. We need to bridge the gap between affordability in our housing market and seniors with fixed income. If their rent increases even by $100, they can't sustain that. And at the same time, our shelters have become a holding place, right? People are waiting for permanent housing that just isn't available. So we need to continue to build affordable housing, permanent supportive housing. On average in our shelters, people are staying 200 days plus waiting for that permanent housing option. So it's really not sustainable. I love that, the Housing Commission with the city presented various options for shelters. We need to consider, bunk beds are not ideal for seniors. So we need to consider options that work for seniors. We need to consider options for seniors. Families. We have so many families that are living in their cars and going into school. The kids are getting ready in their car to go to school. That's just not sustainable. We have to consider the long-term trauma that we're seeing as well.
Drew?
So I'd agree, Lisa, it's a pivotal time for the city when they're staring down the possibility of closing over 600 shelter beds. And I agree with Ryan that a portfolio of strategies is important to roll out. If there's 5,000 people on the street, there's 5,000 different stories and needs. There's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all approach to this. To spar with my guy Levi down there a little bit, let me back up. We're very much focused on the here, the now. How can we help as many people move off the streets as possible, as quickly as possible, or avoid the streets altogether? And our foundation's governed by largely by business people, going back to the late Peter Seidler and Dan Shea and Pat Stephanie Cochetti and others that try to apply business principles to this issue of homelessness. And so, let's pick a $30 million number. Round numbers, that could maybe add 36 housing units. That not, tomorrow or in a month or two, but, years, if not decades away, unfortunately. It's just how long it takes to add housing. But if you were to put that into some various shelter strategies, round numbers, you could, I think, get 1,000 people off the streets at $20,000 or $18,000 per bed. So that's kind of the lane that we try to operate in, is, again, quick, cost-effective strategies that can come online within months to help people at a minimum put a roof over their head, get connected to services, and then determine what their next step is.
I want to ask a question that sort of reflects on both what Drew just said and also what Hanan said about people waiting 200 days in a shelter to get housing. A shelter is not successful unless it is a path to housing. And once people can move on to housing, then other people can come into that shelter and take advantage of it. So just building more shelters isn't necessarily going to solve the homelessness problem unless we also build ways for people to get through those shelters. But it doesn't necessarily have to be traditional solutions like we've thought of. So I would ask everybody, what do we need to do to try to increase the throughput? And do any of you have any ideas of things that San Diego hasn't really scaled? I know Levi has an answer. He's smiling over there.
Yeah. Anybody else want to go first? No?
You can go, Levi.
Okay. So in the panel before this one, it was also mentioned, about how the private sector is the largest builder of our housing here in San Diego. When it comes to operating shelters, when it comes to outreach workers, when it comes to everybody in homeless services, everybody up to a director position is still low income in this city. So when we're talking about operating shelters, we're also talking about being able to staff a 1,000-bed shelter with something like 300-person workforce. Now, if that workforce itself, they're making $40,000 a year, that is not sustainable to be able to live in this city. So I think one of my I've been talking about shared housing for years. I'm super thankful that this year.
Can you define what that is really quick for those who may not know?
So shared housing is really you're matching people up to live together in something like independent living or roommate situations where people are really just co-living together. And so this year I was able to, with the help of Heaven New Art, we started Pave San Diego, which is a shared housing program that now has 19 beds. It is one of the most underexplored and definitely underfunded and supported means of ending homelessness for people here in San Diego. Because typically when somebody does get a housing subsidy or a voucher, in my role as a housing navigator previously, we would be running around with, the voucher is not physical, but we'd be running around saying, hey, I have this tenant for you, I have this tenant for you. And a landlord doesn't have to say I'm not renting to them because they used to be homeless. They don't have to say I'm not renting to them because, they have a third-party check. That demand is so high. And so we've got to be able to create more solutions that realistically are faster. But I think I understand, too, if we start on a large scale talking about reintegrating people into the neighborhoods, obviously the NIMBYs are going to be very upset. And there are so many ILA operators existing in San Diego who are doing the hard work of housing people in this very creative way. And so I would like to see a lot more of that. And an ILA is an independent living association. So same kind of thing as shared housing. And it's essentially you are letting people versus having, a facility where you have a staff member who comes and says, your socks are not allowed to be on the floor. You sort of get that peer support from your roommate who says, hey, bro, could you not leave your socks on? And so I think that is one of the healthiest and most healing ways to reintegrate people into society, and I'd like to see that further supported. So,
thanks for defining ILA. Hanan, your organization operates at some shelters, including one in San Diego. What do you think we need to do?
Just thinking about our shelter operations, we have to have staffing 24/7. And we have high turnover. As Levi mentioned, the income is not sustainable for our shelter workers. And then you're also always short-staffed and people are cycling in and out. When people come into our shelter, it takes us a couple of months at least to stabilize them, right? Like you got to work on the healthcare aspect of it, food and basic needs. And then from there, we can begin working towards a housing plan. And oftentimes they're coming in with zero income or fixed income. So affordability is just not there. So I think increasing the staffing in our shelter operations so that we can really have focused attention on folks and our caseload should be a lot less. And then having various housing options. We know we're short on permanent supportive housing, but exploring more rapid rehousing and having a consistent way of how that rental assistance is offered. Some organizations may offer 3 months, some offer 6 months. But if we were to follow HUD guidelines, it allows us to do it for 24 months. So that gives us at least 2 years to work with folks to get them the income that they need to stabilize and get them towards cost sharing and taking over their rent. So I think we need to increase those types of housing interventions, and always, of course, shared housing if that's available for people. We all live with a roommate, right? Like, I have a husband, we kids, like, they're my roommates. So we need to consider that being an option in San Diego because of just affordability.
I think I really appreciate the explanations that were just given. That on the programmatic level, I completely agree with. I'm going to answer more from the policy-making side. I think that the perspective on policy-making around homelessness and shelter operations needs to shift away from a minimalist approach that begins from an assumption about what people deserve or what policymakers think people deserve, which is essentially that you're lucky to have any service that's provided, and so therefore we will offer the smallest service possible to the widest number of people. That is a failed model, and the best way that I can explain that is that the throughput that you're talking about, the exit of people to housing, occurs at the highest levels in shelter environments that include higher levels of resource and staffing. And the worst outcomes occur in the environments that have the lowest levels of resources and staffing. I've been a big supporter that safe camping and safe parking needs to be a part of the equation, particularly on an emergency basis. However, we also have to recognize the fact that those two interventions have poor outcomes. They have the lowest utilization. We are paying for vacant spots on a regular basis, ongoing. They have the largest number of people who drop out and we lose track of them. And they have the fewest people who exit those programs into housing. On the other hand, some of the more expensive shelter operations, the harm reduction shelter in Midway that is run by Alpha Project, which focuses on people with complex substance use issues, has some of the highest exits to successful exits to housing. So I think if we're going to make progress on the issue, we need to stop thinking about it from the standpoint of bringing the whole system down to the lowest common denominator, both because it fails to make progress, and when you factor in the long-term outcomes, it is not the cheapest approach. It is actually the most expensive approach, is to continue to invest in short-term solutions that yield poor long-term results.
So I think our view is, very broadly speaking, we have to operate along parallel paths. And I think we can all agree housing's an ideal outcome. But we're focused on, we see thousands of people suffering on the streets, and we see how long it takes to add housing and how costly it is, that we're very much focused on how can we help people at a minimum move indoors as quickly as possible. It's kind of like if I gave each of you $1 million and I said, okay, you can help 2 people 2 or 5 or 8 years down the road, or you can help 100 people within a few months. Pretty sure I know which answer you're going to go with. So that's the lane that we operate in. But we think that there should absolutely be folks and organizations focused on how can more housing inventory be added. We're just coming at it from a standpoint of, if housing's the only thing that's focused on, that's like telling passengers on a sinking ship, hang tight, we'll build you some lifeboats sometime in the next 2 to 5 to 20 years, because that's unfortunately just how long it can take to add or build housing. The other thing I think that's critical is there's only 78 detox beds in the entire county that accept Medi-Cal. Okay, so over 90% of people that are ready for that level of help, they can't access it because there's such a significant shortage. And the point in time count might say that whatever the number is, 20 or 25% of folks on the streets have some level of substance abuse or addiction. Well, that's generally, what's the term, self-reported at 4 a.m. to a total stranger. I don't know about you, but I'm not going to self-report my own issues to a total stranger at 4 in the morning. The number, when we talk to a lot of different outreach workers, and a lot of them have been there, done that, the number we overwhelmingly hear is 80%, and some of them are convinced it's way more than that have some level of substance abuse or addiction. So adding detox beds and adding that level of service to help folks truly address what's going on in here, we think is critical for, again, adding short-term options, long-term housing options, but really helping folks get connected to the appropriate level of services to, again, help them address substance abuse, addiction, behavior, and mental health issues that might be plaguing them.
Would any of you like to respond to it?
I just want to say one thing that's not necessarily a disagreement with Drew, but I want to point out that the majority of people in this room, I'm going to assume, use alcohol, cannabis, or other drugs on a regular basis, and you do that while housed. And the detox bed issue is a very real issue, and all of the services that we're talking about are a very real issue. My concern in the policy discussion is that these become sideshows to the real issue, which is that we need shelter and we need housing, and that cannot be dependent upon whether somebody has a mental health condition or substance use, because the vast majority of people who have those issues are housed. And the reason so many of those people with those issues are unhoused in San Diego is because of our cost of housing.
So I'm going to come back to the homelessness plan, which showed that this is, the city hired the Corporation for Supportive Housing to work on a plan about what it would take to significantly reduce homelessness in San Diego in the next 10 years. And this was the updated version. And it did call not just for spending on shelter, but for also spending on a variety of other interventions. Diversion, which is essentially, trying to divert somebody from the homeless service system. So that could be financial resources to help them do that, or maybe even sometimes it's as simple as helping them fix their car so they can keep going to their job. There's also rapid rehousing, which can give people some assistance for a short term. And then there's that longer term housing and also then prevention services. I wanted to go through that because I want to ask this group, how do we think that the city's doing on implementing these plans beyond shelter? We've definitely made some strides in terms of adding shelter beds. We are in a moment right now where we're on the precipice of losing beds. But how do you think we're doing in those other categories? Hanan's laughing, so I'm going to make her answer.
Really backfire. The reality is we're not building enough, right? We have such shortage for housing, and so we need to really address that. And I will say a few things that the city's doing really well. One of the programs that we just started this year is the Encampment Resolution Fund, funded through the state. What we're doing is going to encampments in specific areas and bringing outreach workers to work with individuals in that whole encampment, and then have permanent housing intervention completely assigned to them so that we could get them into housing right away. So the idea of moving people around based on our anti-camping ban doesn't really solve the homelessness, but by getting people into housing, addressing those encampments together, we've seen that to be really successful. So I think in terms of the housing aspect of it, we can build shelters all day, but if we don't have permanent housing to put people into, we'll just keep people in shelters long term, and that will become a permanent housing solution for folks.
And I'll add to the ERF. I was an outreach worker down around the post office last year. That has been that type of innovation and looking at things differently is a huge part of what we need to continue. Working on the ERF, we were able to maintain the contact with our clients so often. When I worked on 16th Street, for example, I would have clients in dire need and then maybe not see them the next week, literally. Whereas ERF, not only were we working off of by name lists, staying in contact with those people, but also to that funding for what their ultimate housing solution was all in the same package. It wasn't, being a case manager and having to seek over here for this service and then, go to the Housing Commission for this piece. Obviously, that still has to happen. But the key part of it was that with ERF, the outreach workers were tasked with going out prior to the police. And so the outreach workers was who everybody was building their relationships with. And so that now we're seeing a lot of those people, the ERF by the post office, now a lot of those people have moved into housing and they're on their way to their next step. So a lot more thinking about things creatively in that way, in a block by block kind of basis, and solving this community by community, because there's a reason that they stay in the areas that they stay in. So
What we are.
encampment resolution funds.
Sorry, I thought Hanan defined it.
I need a reminder on the acronyms too, so thank you. To answer your question, I don't think that we're doing particularly well, and I'm not sure, and that's not to say that particular parts, especially the outreach that was just described, I think is the brightest spot and the types of outcomes that they're talking about. The problem is with the scaling of these solutions. And when we have regionally 300 plus net increase in the homeless population each month, I don't know how we can look at the system as a whole and say anything other than we are not living up to the goals that were described in the community action plan. And I think there's a few things that we can, diagnose about that. One, over a year ago when the encampment ban was passed at the first Housing Commission board meeting, I asked for staff to start giving a report of what percentage of people who were referred to shelter successfully were placed in shelter. In that first month, it was about 1 in 5. 1 in 5 shelter referrals resulted in somebody receiving a bed. At the most recent report last month, it's closer to 1 in 10. Obviously, banning encampments does not reduce homelessness. The second structural barrier I see is the unreliable and insufficient levels of funding. The unreliableness of the funding means that programs are constantly at threat. Workers don't know whether they will have a job the next year. The pay is minimal and the turnover is high. You have frontline workers who staff one shelter and sleep in another shelter. This is a result of the funding being unreliable and never knowing whether it's going to be cut, and everybody being asked to constantly cut to the absolute bone on programs that don't have room for that type of cutting. And the insufficiency of the funding, I think, spans the spectrum from the outreach to the shelter to the housing. As you mentioned with the voucher program, to the extent that we've been producing housing, permanent supportive housing, which is not needed for most unhoused people. They do not need permanent supportive housing, but it is needed for a lot. That has been essentially paid for on the backs of people on the wait list for housing assistance. So we, at some point in the next few years, are going to need some sort of dedicated funding to pay for these programs, because the current system, just by objective numbers, is not working. And that's not because the programs that Eli and Hanan are talking about don't work. We have loads of data to show how they do work. It's that those programs operate on such a small scale that it is never going to be able to address the problem in the current environment.
So I'm not totally sure how to answer the question, how's the city doing in addressing homelessness?
On its plan.
On its plan as well. What I will say is we have a program called Shamrocks and Shipwrecks that's meant to publicly grade political will and effectiveness of local elected officials up and down the county as it relates to addressing homelessness. And I know we're talking just about the city of San Diego. They're obviously the big one. There's 18 cities in all of San Diego County, and so I think part of it is there needs to be a more deliberative approach to working with those other cities, because I think Ryan's and others' point that unsafe camping, if you don't have a place to help people, you're just moving people around. And now you're going to have some cities saying, nope, can't do it here. And it's not truly helping people unless you have a place to move them to. But back on Shamrocks and Shipwrecks, the city leads, and I should say our group doesn't care who's a Democrat, who's a Republican. It's the program is meant to be fact-based so that programs that are working can and should be replicated and to shine a light on those efforts. And then ineffectiveness or inaction gets shipwrecks. The city, I looked today, of all the 18 cities in San Diego County, has the most shipwrecks, but it also has the most shamrocks. And so, I think the city's doing several different things, whether it's pursuing state funding for housing or whether it's working with the county to go after county funds that some other cities aren't doing. It kind of harkens for me back to the John Wooden quote of don't mistake activity for achievement. I think there's a lot of activity. I think there's a lot of well-intentioned programs and decisions being made, but could it be a little more deliberative and thoughtful in terms of executing the plan? I think absolutely, and that's frankly a role we try to play, is to try to accelerate government if we think there's a practical plan in place. If we don't, we're not afraid to be vocal and try to push on some of the electeds to do more quickly. So again, I think there's a fair amount of activity, some good things taking place, but could it improve? Yes, absolutely.
So I have two follow-up questions based on the discussion we were having there. I think I'll start with the camping ban, since two of you brought that up. How do we feel that, or I guess I'll take a step back. So obviously there have been lots of discussions, if you're following the news, across the county, camping bans are in vogue right now. And the city of San Diego has had a camping ban on the books now for more than a year. I'm curious what this group sees as the impact of that. That some people are raising that up as a solution.
So I'll say this because I was a big advocate against the encampment ban. Mainly because one of the things that we called from the very beginning was this is going to push people into your neighborhoods. And whereas before, when the big push for the encampment ban came about, it was, I'm walking my kids to school and they're exposed to homelessness, right? And that was maybe on Washington or Commercial, right? On those main roads. That's where these kids were exposed to homelessness. And we kept saying, if you do this encampment ban, you're going to push people into the actual neighborhoods. So now I live in a really quiet, nice little neighborhood. But that main street, there's not unhoused people on it anymore. But every single night, one by one, headed back to the canyons is people who have nowhere else to go except for literally right through our neighborhoods. My son, wants to skate on the sidewalk, and he knows exactly how to talk to our unhoused neighbors. But it is more in our neighborhoods now than it was last year. And how much more enforcing of this are we going to do and try to say that these people are not San Diego residents? They are. So
I agree with what Levi is saying. We also are opposed to the anti-camping bans because criminalizing homelessness just does not work. We really need the solutions that we know are working. We need to focus on evidence-based practices that we have. Housing first works. We got to get people into housing and keeping them housed through the services. And also, on average, a large percentage of the unhoused population are interested in shelters. We have outreach workers in the city and the county offering shelters, and people are interested. We just don't have anywhere to put them. Ryan gave the stats. 1 out of 10 get into shelters. Our outreach workers wake up first thing and they get people on the list to get them into shelters. They may not get them in. And they try this every day. And if they get them in, they have until noon to find them and help them get there so that bed is reserved for them. And oftentimes people do move around. And if we are enforcing it, they're also going to move around, and outreach workers can't find them. Sometimes they lose their belongings, and it takes us a long time to get people document ready. You need to have your ID, social security, and proof of income to be able to get into housing. That's really the bulk of a lot of what our outreach workers are doing, to get them housing ready so that they don't miss that opportunity when it comes. And so the anti-camping bans are not working, or are just not the solution to addressing homelessness.
Yeah, I take my cues on this subject a lot from people like Hanan and Levi, who are seeing firsthand and interacting with people who are unhoused. It makes complete sense that you can't just ban the existence of not having a home. And I think to your question about the number of cities that are taking this approach, it's a temporary, short-term PR move that gives elected leaders in particular somebody else to blame and a way to say that they're doing something, but it will not in the end make one bit of difference on the subject itself. If Chula Vista passes a ban, they'll be in the same situation that San Diego was in. And even if they, which, I mentioned, we're about half the referral success that we were before the ban. And as Hanan's mentioning, the day-to-day work of doing this, I don't know how. I mean, I have great respect for people who are out there doing that, but we're providing a lot of public funding to do this kind of outreach, and as I mentioned, we're not providing nearly enough. But I don't know what we think we're accomplishing by dramatically increasing the amount of time Hanan's outreach workers have to spend running around trying to find somebody that they were talking to the day before, the week before, because they're in a completely different place, and asking around about if anybody knows where they went. I mean, this is the definition of a broken system. All of that said, I also want to point out that I think that there would be a lot of consensus around scaled back approaches to this. I think the objection to encampment ban ordinances should not be conflated with objections to having an area around elementary schools, right, where encampments cannot be. The problem is that cities take the approach, before the Supreme Court case, they took the approach of being very creative so that it effectively covered everywhere, but didn't say it was covering everywhere. Now they're just saying that they're covering everywhere. If you want encampments to not be around children's playgrounds and schools and other very sensitive places, then you need to not ban encampments everywhere, because that is the quickest way to set up a system that is just totally unworkable. But I have yet to see anybody come forward and say, I'm proposing a narrow encampment ban that has a clear public health and safety. It is treated as a homelessness solution, which it is not.
So we don't believe in the criminalization of homelessness and wouldn't support that. But we do believe in criminalizing criminal behavior. And there was, we actually supported the unsafe camping ban, which was not without, much debate internally with our group. But we had several service providers that said it's entirely out of hand. There has to be a little bit better level or more acceptable level of tough love and the ability for law enforcement to help people connect to services or connect to resources that exist. There's a youth homeless center downtown that for months there was totally unacceptable behavior right outside its fence and its gate. Erratic behavior. These kids were feeling unsafe, and to the point where this organization had to call PD. PD essentially said, our hands are tied. There's nothing that we can do. And so we think if you start by starting with a violent criminal behavior that can persist on the streets. That in and of itself will start to, it will protect those that are literally vulnerable, those who are literally homeless. So that is partly why we supported the unsafe camping ban. But we also said the city absolutely must stand up more pathways off the streets. So again, when you support something like that, then the question becomes, well, where are you going to help people move to? And then the debate is, well, is it going to be, whatever the number is, 30 or 40 people with $30 million or 1,000 people with $30 million? And then the timeline factor as well. So that's, again, why we focus on those immediate pathways that are cost effective off the streets, with the understanding we don't want anybody to stay in shelter for months and months at a time. But if it can help them move off the streets and put that life behind them, absolutely, that's certainly a significant step up.
So I want to come back to something that Ryan brought up earlier, which he was making the point that he sees that the funding for various homelessness programs is really unpredictable, and that creates a lot of problems in addressing the problem. Many advocates think that San Diego needs a funding measure on a future ballot to try to raise the money necessary to really put a significant dent in the problem. I'm curious what panelists think about that.
So my idea is born out of the middle of the night and watching too much Bigger Pockets on YouTube, but I know that we talked about community land trust as a solution for funding and equity, but I also, I think what's interesting in my personal experience, I had the knowledge to know how to trade stocks before I ever ended up homeless. The issue was that back then you were dealing with something like an E-Trade, right? And what happened in 2014 was Robinhood came on the scene. Now everybody has Robinhood in your pockets. I know you do. I'm looking at you guys. So making some of these like more investments like more accessible to people, I think could be huge. And so I would really like to explore the possibility of something like a real estate investment trust, where people are able to invest in San Diego in a way that will get them returns, but also house people in San Diego.
Agreed. We need more sustainable regional funding. Year after year, programs are at risk of being cut. So you have to consider, how do you keep people employed, but also continue to offer those services. So we need that consistent income, some kind of measure that will allow us to be able to have the permanent housing side of it, build housing, because it's really difficult to build affordable housing in San Diego. Just stacking funds is just really challenging. So we need to really eliminate those barriers, and then having those supportive service dollars attached with it as well.
I'm going to answer this in two parts. Yes, I do think that there needs to be some sort of dedicated revenue that funds homelessness and affordable housing for all the reasons that I just mentioned. But I think that also there's plenty of room for us to do better with what we have. And one of the arguments that I have a very hard time with is that because there's room for us to do better with what we have, then we shouldn't pursue revenue. It's a both and situation. To give an example, I was talking about the stacking of funding, and on the affordable housing development side, there was a project that got a lot of attention, and I'm sure that there are going to be more of them that will get similar attention for being, at around $900,000 a door. There is a real problem that there is newly built market rate housing, apartment buildings on the market right now for under $400,000 a door, and it's costing us significantly more than that to build affordable housing from scratch. One of the reasons I want to point out that is the case, that I think is under discussed, is that because you have public funding sources, so much is asked of affordable housing. It is asked to tackle sites that no other private developer wants to tackle. scatter sites in city heights where it requires closing multiple streets for long periods of time in order to build on it that no market rate developer ever wanted to touch. It's asked to make infrastructure improvements and pay for Caltrans maintenance needs on nearby freeway off-ramps because in places that, again, no other private market rate project is touching. It's asked to make environmental remediation and clean up polluted sites. It's asked to provide free community space for nonprofits on the ground floor in what would otherwise be a for-profit commercial space. It's asked to include staffing and services on site. And then we look at it and we say, why are you being so efficient with the money and not building for $400,000 a door like the for-profit developer down the street? Well, because the for-profit developer down the street isn't doing any of those other things. But we need to be clear about our priorities here. If you want the affordable housing to come online faster and cheaper and in larger volume, stop asking it to fix every single problem that we're trying to deal with. And if you have a problem with the mix of affordable to market rate, you could also ask the market rate to do more of those problems, right? So, and I don't want to overemphasize that last part because I think we have a housing problem across the board. But I do want to point out that they exist in completely different worlds. And we need a variety of solutions that both make the money that we have go further and also recognize that even if you did all of that, it would still not come anywhere close to meeting the need that we have.
So, Lisa, the slide you put up there earlier, I don't think there was a dollar amount on there, but I can't imagine it's insignificant what's required to accomplish some of the goals in that plan. And, you know, there was a measure not too long ago that would have, I think, if I'm remembering this correctly, would have taxed tourists, would have expanded the convention center, and provided a significant sum to address homelessness and housing issues that the city faces. And I think somebody put up a considerable sum that I think feels strongly about helping the homeless population, I think, but in opposition to that. And it was this close.
So I can give a quick update on that. That's Measure C. Sorry to interrupt you. Measure C, which is would put some money toward homelessness using tourism tax dollars. Also could help be used to expand the convention center and fund road repairs. It's been stuck in court for years now and is still unresolved. Now we're probably waiting another appeals process. So just to give a quick update on that one.
So I think, it makes me think of Peter Seidler, that he would say a couple of different things. It all comes down to the execution. It's one thing to have a plan, but it's all about how you execute that plan. And he would also say there's no such thing as a perfect strategy in homelessness. And so if there's an ongoing source of funding, I think it comes down to how that is implemented. And is it done with the sense of urgency, and is it done in a truly deliberative manner that, in my mind, operates along a parallel path of immediate pathways off the streets, coupled with more long-term strategies for folks to move into housing and that truly long-term stability that they need.
Now it's time for us to take some of your questions. So if you haven't already, if you have a question, whether you've written it on a note card or not, raise your hand so we can collect those and we can write them on the note cards. So our first question today is going to be asked by Sanjana, an Aaron Price Fellow. So each year, the Aaron Price Fellows program selects 40 kind, inquisitive, open-minded ninth graders from a pool of 300 applicants for a 3-year journey. They go behind the scenes to see how cities function, explore the role of community members in shaping society, and develop empathy and skills for navigating a diverse world. The program is a high school leadership experience started in 1991 by the Price family, and the mission of Aaron Price Fellows is to prepare a highly motivated and diverse group of San Diego public high school students to be responsible, engaged, and caring members of their community. Today, there are over 1,000 Aaron Price Fellows alumni, with 500 locally carrying out the mission of the program by making a difference in their families, careers, and communities. Like to come up?
Good.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I just wanted to ask, like, in light of the many different issues that are facing San Diego's relationship with homelessness, especially including the recent Grants Pass Supreme Court ruling that legitimized encampment bans and said that they were not unconstitutional, a lot of concern has been raised that San Diego may increase punitive measures and the criminalization of homelessness, which will only exacerbate the issue, as was talked about. I just wanted to ask, what do you believe is the one most crucial step right now for San Diego to develop effective solutions addressing the root causes of homelessness? And what do you see as the biggest obstacle that is preventing us from getting there?
Excellent. Thank you. Big fan of the Aaron Price Fellows. Thank you guys for always providing such great input. I think one of the biggest obstacles that we have is that in these, like, trying to solve this with interim solutions or band-aid solutions, it's really telling as far as those kind of solutions coming from a place of we don't think we can do it. It comes from a place of defeat. It comes from a place of, oh, well, we've tried, right? But and not to just sound philosophical on this, but we have to believe that we can do this. We've seen in other areas, like in Finland, right, in Austria, how they've been able to dramatically decrease their homelessness by going through different types of shelter to transitional to housing solutions. And so I will say, too, if you guys, your homework tonight, a lot of times that we look at that and we're like, oh, well, that's Europe. That's a different country. That's blah, blah. Mark Horvath just put out a video yesterday for Invisible People in Hennepin County that is in the United States. That is a smaller place than San Diego. And if they are able to end homelessness, then we can at the very least believe that we can. So,
Great question. So I think when we talk about housing first, sometimes we forget that housing first is not just getting people into housing, is doing the services and the wraparound services to keep people housed is the key component of housing first. And part of that is looking at the core issue that led the person to becoming homeless. We have to be able to work with them in addressing that so that they can stabilize. And in the event that they have a situation that comes up, they're able to actually address that and be able to remain still in housing. Part of that is when we get people into housing, we want them embedded into their communities. Think about when you move into a new home, new neighborhood, you think about where the grocery store is, what's around you, and those are the things we like really try to make sure is available. Like we provide that information to them so they can really begin being part of their community. The other aspect is prevention. We really need to keep people in housing. If you're homeless even for a day, it's traumatic, and we want to prevent that from happening by keeping people in housing, increasing our prevention services, not wait until they have an eviction notice, but right when they get that notice, being able to pay what's needed for them to remain there, and doing the wraparound services to keep them in housing. In some situations, people are in housing that they may never sustain or afford. So we need to be able, while they're in there, find another affordable place for them to move into without them having to actually become homeless. And then the other aspect we really need is shallow subsidy. We have to be able to provide that affordability gap because of our housing costs. It's just not something we can mitigate right now without having some shallow subsidy to support people with fixed income.
I think Hanan gave a great overview of the multi-pronged approach. Your question was very hard, by the way. And the multiple things that are needed. I'm going to try to answer that one thing, because I don't think you can point to a single program, as her answer points out. If there's one thing I could change that I think would make the biggest difference, it would be a consensus in our community and our civic and political leadership that housing and homelessness services are community building assets rather than a liability that is supposed to be fought and pushed to somewhere else. And this is something that I think that we're getting closer to. And in my private work, I do a lot of public opinion polling, and I see a much bigger consensus around this among the public than I see around the political and the policy discussion. People need to, and this is from the top down to voters and regular residents, view new apartments in their neighborhood as a benefit to the community because we have a housing shortage. They need to view affordable housing in their neighborhoods as a benefit to the community because people who are in need of affordable housing are at risk of homelessness by the tens of thousands. They need to view shelters and permanent supportive housing as a benefit and asset to their community because the alternative to those things is homelessness occurring on the street. And we are past the era where this can be segregated out and our society can be organized in such a way that this is a problem that exists over in one corner of the city and the wealthier parts of the city don't have to experience it at all. We're past that point. There are too many policies that are rightly in place to prevent that from happening. The public is not going to tolerate that kind of an organization, and homelessness is reaching into every community. I did a survey this year that asked people about whether homelessness has increased or decreased in their neighborhood. Almost every neighborhood in the city of San Diego, the majority of people said it had increased, and almost nobody said it had decreased. And so this is affecting every single neighborhood, and what we need to get our heads around, again, from the resident all the way up to the mayor and the county supervisors, we need to get our heads around the idea that this is not a hot potato to be passed around anymore, but these are community assets that have to be built and need to be built across our entire region.
Excellent question. To try to be brief, I think it's probably an overused word, but I think it's critical is a collaborative approach between the county of San Diego, between the city of San Diego, between all 17 other cities and mayors, to, as Ryan said, have a multi-pronged approach, a multi-pronged strategy, but not just talk about it, to actually implement it with a serious sense of urgency. When COVID hit, the convention center was open within a month, maybe even weeks, 1,500 beds just like that, and a significant number of people could move off the streets, and a significant number of people moved into housing through that effort. And that's just one example that I think something like COVID can compel that sense of urgency and that truly collaborative approach. And I think if that same sense of urgency can be applied now across the electeds, across the private sector, across philanthropy, I think you'd see better and quicker results. So that's my short answer.
So one of the questions we got from the audience is, what can the city do that it isn't already doing to create more housing units for the homeless to transition into? I know Levi already has an answer to that one, but...
Yes, this comes back to supporting frontline workers and also being able to house people quicker and more cost efficient. So one of the, I was fortunate to speak at the RTFH conference last year in December. And one of the questions that I posed to the group in the room, which was full of frontline service providers, is, we have a 10% state rent cap, right? But frontline workers' wages are not going up 10% every year. If they are lucky, they go up like 10 cents a year, right? And so when you start to get into that higher low income range, like what can we do to be able to increase home ownership amongst some of our higher low income workers, right? And so I asked in this room, if you were offered down payment assistance on a multifamily property in exchange for taking a voucher, for example, thus creating that affordable housing, would you do it? and every single person raised their hand. And so I think that increasing home ownership amongst the frontline workers who already know how to de-escalate in a situation, and same as you said too, sometimes people don't need permanent supportive housing, they just need that housing and then maybe some direction or guidance from time to time. But I would love to see more down payment assistance programs, and also particularly too, right, the difference when you go to get a mortgage, if you're an investor versus you're going to live in the property, they put what's called an owner-occupied contingency in there. So if you are purchasing a home that you're going to live in, you pay 5% down, versus if you're purchasing a home that you plan to Airbnb out, you're going to put 20% down. So adding some things like that, like an owner-occupied contingency, making sure that the people receiving down payment assistance for the homes in San Diego, first-time home buyers, we all know that there are 20 loops around that, and that our investors who live in other states know those loopholes best. So being able to get some of these homes, it was also brought up earlier about, the Airbnbs and blah, blah, blah. And do we want to go after the Airbnb people and say, you can't do this anymore? No, but what can we do is we can create that competition where San Diegans are actually owning these homes. So
I will address from pay equity stand for our frontline workers. That's really challenging. Ryan touched on it earlier too. You have outreach workers or people who work in shelters living in their cars or street homeless doing this work. So it's really challenging to do this. And in order for us to actually get compensated our staff well, we need to increase our bed rate that we get paid for our shelters to provide the level of service that we do. So I think that would be my ask for the city. And of course, housing.
I'll go bigger on the last thing Hanan said, the housing part. All of these programs play an important role, and in particular, I'll mention one. The shallow subsidy programs are some of the most efficient interventions, and by this, there are a few of them. One of them being the housing instability and prevention program, which provides direct financial assistance to people who are within 2 weeks of homelessness, I believe, on either side. It is a fully subscribed program. The amount of money that goes into that, into each case, is often less than a third or less than 25% of what it costs to shelter somebody once they become homeless. So if you think about that, it can cost us a quarter as much to prevent somebody who's at imminent risk of becoming homeless as compared to being homeless. But none of these things really are sustainable as a holistic solution without the availability of the housing inventory. If we were to rely, for example, solely on those direct financial interventions, we would quickly essentially just be driving up the cost of rent in the region as we threw more and more money at rising rents to try to prevent people from falling into homelessness with varying degrees of success. That's what would happen without an increase in the amount of housing inventory, particularly the kind of inventory that is available to people in these situations. So on that front, I think that there are things that have been done. The city waived its permitting fees for small studio apartments, and I am a big believer in investing in the quality of housing and wraparound services that have been mentioned. But when I asked about some of these apartments that have been built under that program with that fee waiver, in a market rate context, they are renting at something around what equates to about 100% AMI, meaning the average income to a single person, or if you had two people sharing a studio, dramatically less than that. So without any deed restriction, without any public money other than the fee waiver in the mix, a brand new apartment is coming into the market at, and I realize there's a lot of complaints about this, that it should be cheaper than that. But without any of those other constraints, it's still something that is achievable to somebody who is not making a lot of money or as Levi's pointing out, people who are bunking up, even more so. We need many, many, many more things coming online that are outside of the limited resources of housing resources, right? That the market is generating. We need to get very creative about how we produce that inventory, especially as we deal with the aging senior population that is in more need of those types of studios than ever before, and is also accounting for the largest percentage of newly homeless individuals on our streets than ever before.
I think if the question is, what can the city do to add housing inventory to help more homeless individuals move into that housing? I think the permitting process is incredibly lengthy and costly for some of the larger developments. So if that can be, some of that red tape eliminated, that will make, I think, some meaningful steps forward possible. And then I think the city should identify vacant and underutilized city-owned properties that could be quickly converted either to shelter or to housing. I think to be concise, those are two things that we think would help the city more effectively add housing to then help people move into that housing.
Another question we got is, does it make more sense to reinforce existing shelter beds rather than to create what this person described as low success rate beds in the future so that aren't open? So basically what they're asking is, does it make more sense to bolster the resources of the existing shelters rather than to open new beds?
So I mentioned earlier the emergency proposals in front of the city right now include a net increase in the next 4 months if we were to utilize all of them. A lot of those changes involve reallocating how many beds we have located at different sites and what population those are serving to more efficiently use the properties that we already have, as well as things like securing blocks of hotel rooms. I would generally agree. I'm not sure what reinforce exactly means, but I would generally agree that it makes a lot more sense to look at how we make existing shelter resources have a higher throughput. That makes a lot more sense than, for example, buying a warehouse and starting from scratch on a model that we know it is going to have a lot of problems generating success. I think there's a lot of questions, for example, around the Veterans Village and what's going to happen with that campus. That is a very large site that is already configured for these services that is severely underutilized right now because of organizational challenges and state funding challenges that have been happening there. So yes, we need to put far more thought into what resources are necessary to be sited at shelters to make them work for the purpose they're supposed to work, and less about how do we stack monks 3 high at the maximum density to create the numbers. That should not be the ultimate goal. You don't need to pack people in like sardines if their stay in a shelter is shorter than it is right now.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I agree. I think we do need to, do the shelters well, like the ones we have, right? And increase the success rate. I think we are maybe at 27% success rate getting people into housing. And we could do better if we had additional resources. Again, though, like the shortage in housing still makes it challenging to get people out of shelter environments. And just the sheer number of how many people we have unhoused is also very challenging to address without having more beds.
I think if the question is augment existing shelters with more services or try to expand shelter capacity, we'd recommend expanding shelter capacity. And if anybody in this room would ever like to tour a bridge shelter, I'm happy to personally tour you. These are structures that our foundation purchased and constructed. We donate the use of them to the city. Are they perfect? No. Are they significantly better than the streets? Absolutely. And I think Lisa's slide showed an 18% positive exit rate from those shelters. I think the question I'd ask, well, what's the positive exit rate from the streets? into housing. I guarantee it's going to be nowhere close to that. And so, again, our view is let's help people move off the streets at a minimum, put a roof over their head, get into a warm bed, get connected to some nourishment, start the process of triage, and then identify, is there a family member you can go back with? Is there a housing unit we can get you into? Are there employment opportunities to help folks self-resolve and get back to self-sustainability? But I cringe a little bit at this thought of packing people in like sardines. Again, if anybody would ever like to tour one with me, more than happy to go through there with you. We think they're not perfect, but folks there are so relieved to have put the streets behind them and be on a more productive path. So again, if the question is, do we invest more resources in existing shelters or try to expand capacity? Let's help more people move off the streets would be our stance.
Do you have anything to add?
I just wanted to add to Drew's point about success rate. So part of our outreach work is that we provide street-based case management, and our goal is even if shelter is not available, we are working on that housing option. So we do get people from street to housing in, and the way our coordinated entry system is set up, it prioritizes the most vulnerable. And what that means is people on the street are prioritized higher in a sense because they are on the street than folks on the shelter. So as a system, we are getting people from the street into housing. You just may not see the change just because of how many people we have unhoused on the street. But the success happens.
Did you want to say anything?
I guess just sort of anecdotally, I've heard today as well that the thoughts on, we are getting people housed. And I've been doing outreach and case management in San Diego for 6 years now. And the problem that we see is like the bleeding doesn't stop. It's just more people every single day. And this is really just a quick story, but there was one day where I was talking to another outreach worker and we were in front of a peach tree. And I said to him, every single day in San Diego, 1 to 2 more people enter our streets for the first time who had never been homeless before. And I kid you not, there was a gentleman standing behind me with tears in his eyes, and he said, today it was me. And so while we are able to get people into housing, as soon as an outreach worker gets somebody into shelter or into housing, there's 1 to 2 more right there before them. And that person does not know all that is the broken homeless services system on that first day. And so you're really just sort of pedaling through this, but we've got to stop it. So.
Well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have. Please join me in thanking this excellent panel. And Deborah is going to come up with some closing thoughts.